Right, I am one of these strange creatures that Shane referred to earlier on, an acoustician, a noise consultant, thank you very much, slightly absent-minded noise consultant at times. On good days, we do noise, that is, we take spaces which don't sound terribly nice and we try to make them sound nicer, and on even better days, we design spaces so that they sound nice in the first instance. And quite a lot of the time, we actually think we've done our job as well as possible when people don't actually mention the acoustics of a space at all, because then we know there's nothing wrong with it, which much of the time is as good as you can get. And to date, designing schools has largely been about there being nothing badly wrong with them. And the Essex study is one of the first studies I've worked on where, in fact, an enlightened local authority, Essex County Council, have spent a certain amount of money, and quite a bit of the NDCS's and FPS's money as well, thank you both to them, but also a huge amount of their own time and dedication to this particular cause to produce what has become known as the Essex Study, which sounds a little bit too much like a television program, but never mind. If I can just, at this stage, put in a minor plug also for the Association of Noise Consultants, simply by pointing out that, much to the surprise, I suspect, of one or two of the board members of the ANC who are sitting in this room, this has actually been published by them. I did not do the research work for this study. It was actually done by one of my colleagues, a very senior and extremely talented audiologist, educational audiologist, David Canning. And at the end of the day, having done all of this, David was unfortunately unable to put all of the data together. So we needed somebody with a bit more time to do that, and that, unfortunately, was Muggins. So I foolishly agreed that I would take all this data and turn it into the report, which is now published on the NDCS and the ANC and a few other websites as well. Where we start from, really, is the basis on which all of education is based. And I won't apologize for saying this again, it's been said already, it's all about communication. We are trying to teach children to listen, we're trying to provide an environment in which children can listen, and this is the ultimate listening environment, really. It's very sweet at the end of a primary school day. In a lot of primary schools, in a lot of classes, the children sit down in a circle on the floor, which you hope is clean, and they listen to the teacher. The teacher reads a story, and they sit very quietly and do it. I've measured noise levels while they've been doing this, and the minimum noise levels while this is going on can actually drop down to studio levels, 20, 25 dBA or less. Even with me standing in the classrooms and all the kids going, "What's that man with a microphone doing over there, miss?" The reality is that, of course, they grow up at some stage and they start actually taking much more part in the education process, and they start talking back, sometimes because the teacher wants them to and sometimes because they just do. And we have to provide an environment for them not just to be able to listen to the teacher, but also to communicate with each other and with the teachers as well. And it was in order to provide a reasonable kind of environment like this that those enlightened and intelligent people at the Department for Education actually produced the Building Bulletin 93. They came up with the very, very worthy idea that, in fact, we needed standards, regulations. I'm told I'm not allowed to call them regulations because you can work your way around them, but they are, to all intents and purposes, regulations. Building Regulation E4 basically says, leaving out the long words, schools must have acoustic conditions which are fit for purpose. Okay, that's fairly obvious, but beforehand, that was a guideline, and it was built into the Education Premises Act, and it was almost universally ignored in both meanings of the word. People didn't know it existed, and those few people who knew it existed didn't do anything about it because they didn't have to. Schools cost money to build. The more bits and pieces you build into a school, the more expensive they become. So, 2003, 2004, Building Regulation E4 came out and said this, and people panicked because all of a sudden contractors were having to provide reasonable acoustics in schools. You would have thought that we'd asked them to gold plate the damn buildings. It was extraordinary. It's not a difficult thing to do. Trevor's pointed this out. A little bit later, I think Julian might actually be telling us what it does cost to do this. But nonetheless, it sets minimum standards. My guess is that about 75% of schools that have been built since this regulation came in do actually comply with these standards. The other 25% have slipped through the net because it's not really enforced. Building control officers have to enforce it. They also have to enforce parts A to Z of building regulations. They're a bit more concerned about whether the school's going to burn down or fall down, rather than whether or not the acoustics are okay. And to be honest, most of them are not acousticians. They don't know how to do it. So we have a set of minimum standards. They are not aspirational standards. They are not standards for excellence. Nonetheless, this is the situation which David Canning and his team found when they were approached by Alan Knibb and Greg Keeling and their enlightened team at Essex and said, please can you help us with this problem, particularly with acoustics for children with hearing loss. And that's where it started from. David wasn't thinking about anything other than deaf children, children with hearing impairment, however we wish to express it. Now, David had been working for some time with the National Deaf Children's Society, NDCS, whose website I would strongly commend you to, not least because it has these hearing loss simulations on them. You will have heard a few of these already, but it's interesting just to listen sequentially to a few of these interesting synthesizations of what it sounds like to be deaf, whether partially deaf, whether deaf with a kind of deafness which extreme old age brings onto you, or noise-induced deafness, or having a cochlear implant. The first time I heard these, I actually had to go back and retune not just my ears, but my computer and my whole sound system, because I thought something was badly wrong. I can guarantee to you that they're right. I'm going to play these 5 samples through to you in sequence without me saying anything in between, purely so that you can understand the difference in sound that simply having not just some hearing impairment, but also noise imposed on those hearing impairments inflicts on you. You can read them all up there. I won't say anything while they're going on.
The north wind and the sun. The north wind and the sun were arguing one day about which of them was the stronger. The north wind and the sun. The north wind and the sun were arguing one day about which of them was the stronger. The north wind and the sun. The north wind and the sun were arguing one day about which of them was the stronger.
The north wind and the sun. The north wind and the sun were arguing one day about which of them was the stronger. The north wind and the sun. The north wind and the sun were arguing one day about which of them was the stronger.
I should perhaps explain that HF there is acoustician's shorthand for high-frequency hearing loss. You probably worked that out for yourselves. The other thing you probably worked out for yourselves was that having a cochlear implant is pretty tough in ideal acoustic conditions. With background noise to cope with as well, it's impossible. So, where did the study start from? Very simple concept. Let's take 4 nominally identical classrooms. Maths classrooms, as it happened, you take 4 all where the same subject is being taught because you remove one variable from all of the equations that way. Treat 3 of those classrooms to the various acoustic standards which are set out in Building Bulletin 93 and ultimately in the BATOD, British Association for Teachers of the Deaf standard, which I will explain in a second. Teach the children in them and then move everything round. Now, it's actually quite difficult to change the acoustic conditions in a school with any kind of accuracy without actually making it really obvious what you've done. And one of the great things about this study is that that's exactly what was done. Ecophon and David and all their colleagues were actually, over the weekends, moving everything around, changing things, changing the acoustic absorption of ceilings and panels, but leaving them all looking the same. The one exception to this was the control classroom, which of course didn't have an acoustic ceiling in it. That's a bit of a dead giveaway. You couldn't do anything about that. But nonetheless, it's useful to know that is a control classroom. I'm now going to lower the turn by introducing some acoustics into all of this in terms of that much overused acoustic parameter, the reverberation time. The reverberation time is reckoned to be responsible for everything in room acoustics. This is a huge oversimplification, but nonetheless, it is probably the most basic and the most probably the most basic and the most useful parameter that we have for this kind of thing. Yes, that came out roughly right. So you are speaking to the person who, a short while ago, managed to describe himself as the ex-chairman of the Association of Nose Consultants. I mean, it's just... So we start with a reverberation time of about 1.0 seconds. I should perhaps explain for the technically minded among us that the reverberation time set out in Building Bulletin 93, the regulatory reverberation times, are an average of the figures from 500 to 2 kilohertz, so mid-frequency, speech frequency. They don't take any account at all of what's going on down here, kind of left-hand side of the piano keyboard. There's a recommendation about what you ought to do down there, but it's buried in one of the notes to one of the tables and very rarely gets noticed. So start with a basic classroom, then on to the what we can get away with under BB93 classroom for secondary school, which is 0.8 seconds mid-frequency, then down to 0.4 seconds, which is the standard for rooms which are designed for use for teaching the hearing impaired. Now, that's a great set of weasel words for people to wangle out of doing anything about it, because I quite frequently get called into classrooms to say, well, we're trying to teach the hearing impaired in here, but it wasn't designed for them, so we don't have to do anything about it, which is not an ideal way of having to deal with these things. And then finally, the Batod standard, which is a green line, which is actually thou shalt not at any frequency band exceed 0.4 seconds reverberation time. That is quite difficult to achieve. Shane earlier on showed how to achieve it, and that is if you're starting from an ideal classroom. To achieve these different reverberant conditions in existing classrooms under the constrictions which were involved in this study actually was a major achievement, and a lot of very, very subtle acoustic design went into it. I would like to take some of the credit for it, but I can't because David did it. And also, I think, very much helped by Shane and Adrian and his colleagues in Ecophon. Now, a great deal of data was collected in various ways through all of this, and if you look at the full body of the report, you will get some kind of idea of the summary of that data. This is a summary of a summary of the summary of the data, but it is one of the results which is most clearly indicative of the clarity of the results in terms of a subjective response to the space against the acoustics. It was effectively a study carried out over one day when a panel of acousticians, teachers, I think there may even have been one or two architects who sneaked into the entire thing, and other general worthies were shown around the school. I think there was even a professor of acoustics involved, very dangerous people to involve. And they listened to all of the rooms without knowing which room was which, other than the fact that they had a pretty good guess that the one without the acoustic ceiling was the most reverberant one, and then were asked to fill in a form with all these fairly straightforward descriptors, really. So if you look up on the left-hand side, the MA3 room, which was the one treated as a Batod standard, was generally considered to be very distinct. At the other extreme, if we look at the middle there, the effortless was the acoustic, was speaking in there, effortless. You can see that the MA5 control room, which is the room with no acoustic treatment at all, was sometimes effortless. And an interesting thing about all of these is that however you produce that data, however you present it, there's no overlap. It doesn't matter what descriptor you use for this, and it doesn't matter how you present the data, none of the lines cross each other. I thought that was quite surprising because it's a relatively small sample size, and you would expect that just from statistical variation, there would be some crossover on this. And so being a scientist and cynical and reluctant to believe anything that anyone ever tells me, I went back and looked through this data fairly carefully, and no, that is actually what came out. I would not have thought that you would get, in particular, such a large variation, such a large subjective improvement between the BB93 standard at mid-frequencies only and the Batod standard, where we are effectively reducing the low-frequency reverberation time. So we got a bit pretentious scientifically, and we created what we call a CAT model of the room, a computer acoustic model of the room. It's much easier than actually doing the work in the rooms themselves, because it saves you an awful lot of mucking about with acoustic materials and so on. It's also faster and cheaper. So very simply, we created models of the classrooms. We mucked about with the finishes until we achieved rooms which had the same acoustics as those measured in them. Those eminent acousticians sitting in the rooms know exactly how we do this because they do it every day of the week. And then we fed signals into them. The first signal that we fed into them was purely a hand clap. The first thing we do when we walk into a room to assess the acoustics, you clap your hand and see how long the sound goes on for. It's cheap, it makes it look as if you know what you're talking about, and you don't have to carry a lot of kit around with you. We used to fire off guns, but we're dissuaded from carrying guns into schools. Occasionally we use balloons. Now, I do actually have students who go on courses in how to blow up balloons without injuring themselves. It's health and safety is very important. So, okay, let's hear some hand claps in these 4 rooms in the order in which you see them on the screen there. Just give you some kind of idea as to whether or not you can hear any difference there. That's pretty subtle. You can hear a difference between the first 2 and the last 2. I couldn't put my hand on my heart and say that if you played those back to me in any order, I could tell the difference between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But one of the most striking results that came out of this whole study was what I'm going to offend a lot of purists by referring to as a signal-to-noise ratio. It's nothing of the sort. It's an indication of signal-to-noise. And for this, we just have to think about 2 different types of noise. Speech. The signal, what the teacher is saying, we'll just take the simple case of a teacher standing in front of a classroom and talking, and the background noise that the class makes at the time. The background noise is the noise the teacher has to be heard over, but it is also affected by the acoustic of the room. We've heard this several times, either the Lombard effect or the library effect. As the reverberant noise level goes up, as the reverberation time increases, so the Lombard effect kicks in and children become noisier, the general background noise ramps up quite quickly. But you'll see here that if we look at the effect of the noise levels against the reverberation time, the L90 here, which is an indication of the background noise and which pretty much excludes the sound the teacher is making, goes up as the reverberation time increases much more steeply than the LEQ, which we can take as being an indication of the sound the teacher is making. It's a pretty broad and crude experiment, but it works. And the reason it works is because David stood at the back of classrooms for 120 hours worth of lessons and very, very carefully recorded all of this stuff. And if you actually do a scatter plot around these lines aren't just drawn at random through a large kind of wodge of plots that looks like an outbreak of measles in a pig farm. They are actually good, pretty good, well-fitted, well-correlated lines. But I still didn't believe it. Hence, back to the acoustic model. And we put a background babble noise and a speech signal, which you might recognize from something which happened a little while ago, into this, reproducing those levels there just to show what it sounds like. And I think it's quite interesting. Again, we'll hear them in the order in which you see them up there.
In language, infinitely many words can
Infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters. In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters. In language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
Now, the background noise is still there in all four of those, but in the last two, it's almost dropped off the end of the scale. The signal-to-noise ratio is getting very much better. That, I think, is the most important result of this whole study. David may disagree with me because he did a lot of very, very much more advanced measurement work, but I think that is a wonderful illustration of what everybody so far has been saying here, but has never actually been shown in such a direct way before, simply because we can do the computer simulation of it in here. So, the benefits of all of this. Obviously, less vocal effort needed from the teachers. £200 a day, I think Simon said, it costs when a teacher is off sick, and £150,000 halfway through a teacher's career. Overall, the noise levels come down, which is great primarily for the children with cochlear implants and with hearing aids, but is also brilliant for all of the children, again, for good educational reasons. We're still getting a better signal-to-noise ratio than we had before. We get better behavior, and that better behavior, there were a lot of quotes in the study that we were able to refer to where teachers were very specific. Behavior gets better, therefore I can do something more risky. I can ask the children to look into something more difficult. I can take risks. I can educate to a greater level than I could beforehand, something which hadn't occurred to me. But it is a real benefit. So the conclusion is fairly straightforward. We have minimum standards out there. It's great. The minimum standards in school have actually had a huge impact, but nonetheless, they're minimum standards. If we go beyond those and adopt the standards which Essex, I understand, are now adopting throughout all of their schools, if you look for something better, you get better results. Not just a bit better, but a lot better. I would finally just like to point out that all of the results, the reports, the summary of the report, and those audio files which you've heard are all available on the NDCS and the ANC and the Here to Learn and possibly also the AJA websites. They should be going on in the next few days. And if anyone can't get them to work or disagrees with them or so on, they can read the report and find out who to shout at about it. Thank you very much.